Daniel Carter had stopped believing that life could surprise him. At 38, he was a single father raising his 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, on a struggling farm in Ohio. The farm was falling apart. The roof leaked, the paint was peeling, and every month the bank demanded more money. But it was home. 3 years earlier, Daniel had lost his wife, Claire. Since then, he had learned to do everything alone. He packed Sophie's lunches, helped with homework, worked during the day, and drove deliveries at night. He was exhausted, but he never let Sophie see it, because every time she smiled at him, Daniel remembered why he kept going. Then, one freezing November night, everything changed. It was almost midnight when Daniel's phone rang. It was Sophie. "Dad." Her voice was barely a whisper. "There's someone outside." Daniel immediately sat up. "Where?" "Near the barn." Daniel grabbed his flashlight. "Stay inside. Lock the door." He stepped into the freezing darkness. Near the old red barn, his flashlight revealed a woman sitting against the wall. She looked exhausted. Her coat was far too thin for the weather. Beside her was a small brown suitcase. Daniel stopped. "Are you okay?" The woman slowly looked up. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry for what?" "For being here." Daniel looked toward the empty road. "Do you need a ride?" She shook her head. "I don't have anywhere to go." Daniel knew that feeling. He looked at her trembling hands. Then he made a decision. "You can sleep in the barn tonight." The woman stared at him. "Why would you help me?" Daniel hesitated. "My wife used to say that if you have enough to share, you share." The woman's expression suddenly changed. "Your wife, Claire." The woman went completely silent. Daniel noticed. "You know that name?" She looked away. "No." But Daniel could tell she was hiding something. He brought her a blanket, food, and an old heater. Before leaving, he told her to lock the barn from inside. The woman thanked him. Daniel walked back toward the farmhouse. But halfway there, he turned around. She was still standing in the doorway, watching him. And Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't come to his farm by accident. The next morning, the barn was empty. The woman was gone. So was her suitcase. But then Daniel noticed something on his kitchen table. A white envelope. His name was written across it. Daniel. He opened it. The first sentence made his heart stop. "Daniel, you don't know me, but I knew Claire." Daniel sat down. The woman identified herself as Margaret Ellis. Then came the sentence that terrified him. "Your wife asked me to find you if something ever happened to her." Claire had never mentioned Margaret. Not once. Why would a stranger have a promise from his dead wife? Daniel kept reading. Then he reached the sentence that changed everything. "Claire believed you would eventually lose the farm." Daniel stared at the page. Why would Claire have believed that? Then Margaret gave him an address. An abandoned train station 40 miles away. And beneath it were 5 words. "Go where Claire first lied." Daniel looked up. For 3 years, he thought he knew his wife. Now he wasn't sure anymore. The abandoned station had been forgotten for decades. Broken windows, dust-covered floors, an old wooden bench. Daniel searched everywhere. Nothing. Then he noticed something carved into the bench. A tiny heart, and beneath it were 2 initials. C+M. Claire and Margaret. Daniel sat down. He remembered Claire mentioning this town years ago. She had told him she worked here during college, but she'd never explained why. Daniel searched again. Behind an old cabinet, he discovered a small metal box. Inside was a photograph. Claire and Margaret. They looked much younger. On the back was a handwritten sentence. "For the girls who didn't get to choose their beginning." Daniel stared at the words. Then he found something else. A list. Dozens of names. And beside each name was money. Hundreds of dollars. Sometimes thousands. At the bottom was Claire's handwriting. "Everyone deserves one person who doesn't give up on them." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. His wife hadn't been hiding money. She had been giving it away, quietly helping people who had nowhere else to turn. Then Daniel saw a name he recognized. Margaret Ellis. Beside it were the words, $8,000. Emergency housing. The woman in his barn wasn't a stranger. Claire had saved her. That evening, Margaret returned. She stood at the end of Daniel's driveway. Daniel walked toward her. This time, he didn't ask her to leave. "You knew my wife." Margaret nodded. "Yes." "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she didn't want you to know." "Why?" Margaret looked toward the farmhouse. "Because Claire knew you would try to fix everything yourself." Daniel looked down. That sounded exactly like Claire. Then Margaret told him the truth. Claire had been part of a small group of women helping others rebuild their lives. She used her own savings. She never wanted recognition. But before she died, Claire made Margaret promise something. "If something happens to me, make sure Daniel doesn't give up on the farm." Daniel frowned. "Why the farm?" Margaret handed him a document. Daniel read it, then read it again. Years earlier, a county survey error had left a valuable portion of his property incorrectly classified. Claire had discovered the mistake. She had been working quietly to correct it, but she wasn't planning to sell the land. She wanted to turn part of the farm into a place where struggling families could stay while rebuilding their lives. Daniel couldn't believe it. She was going to do this? Margaret nodded, but she never finished. Daniel's stomach tightened. "Why?" Margaret hesitated. "The bank knows about the land." Daniel understood immediately. "They're coming for the farm." "Yes." "How long?" 30 days. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He walked through the farmhouse. Every room reminded him of Claire. Then he remembered something she had once told him. "If you ever need to find something important, look where we buried our first dream." The old apple tree behind the barn. The place where he and Claire had planted their first tree together. Daniel grabbed a shovel. Sophie followed him outside. "Dad, what are you doing?" "I think your mom left something for us." They dug. Nothing. Then Sophie's shovel hit metal. Daniel froze. Together, they pulled a small steel box from the earth. Inside the box were photographs, letters, legal documents, and one final note. Claire's handwriting. Daniel unfolded it with trembling hands. The first line nearly broke him. "Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm probably not here to explain why I kept this from you." He couldn't continue. Sophie reached for his hand. "Keep reading, Dad." So he did. Claire explained everything. She knew the farm was struggling. She knew Daniel might eventually lose it. So she had spent years preparing something. Not an escape for herself. Not a fortune for their family. A future for people who had even less than they did. At the bottom of the letter was one final sentence. "You once asked me what I wanted our daughter to inherit." Daniel's vision blurred. The next line read, "It isn't money." Then came the words, "I want her to inherit the belief that when you have enough strength to help someone else, you do." Daniel finally broke down. Sophie wrapped her arms around him. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't hide his tears. 12 days later, Daniel walked into the bank. He expected to lose everything. But he wasn't alone. Margaret was there. And behind her were the women Claire had helped years earlier. A nurse, a bakery owner, a construction worker, a social worker. Women Claire had helped when nobody else would. They had come back. Together, they provided the documents needed to establish the foundation. The bank agreed to restructure Daniel's debt. The county approved the plan. 6 months later, the old farmhouse became something Claire had dreamed about. Not a luxury property, not a fortune, a home. A temporary home for families who had nowhere else to go. Daniel named it the Claire Carter House. On opening day, Sophie stood beside her father. Children were running through the yard. Families were carrying boxes into their temporary rooms. For the first time, the farm felt alive again. Sophie looked at her father. "Dad, yeah, Mom helped all these people?" Daniel smiled. "She tried." Sophie looked at the house. "Then I think we should keep trying too." Daniel squeezed her hand. "Yeah, we should." Months later, Daniel found Margaret sitting beneath the old apple tree. He sat beside her. "You knew Claire would do all this, didn't you?" Margaret smiled. She always believed people were better than their worst day. Daniel looked toward the house. Why did you sleep in my barn that night? Margaret laughed softly. I needed to know something. What? Whether you were still the man Claire believed you were. Daniel smiled. And Margaret stood. You let a complete stranger sleep in your barn. She looked toward the farmhouse. Claire was right. Then she walked away. Daniel watched her disappear down the driveway. He looked at the children playing, at Sophie, at the house Claire had dreamed of, and finally understood what his wife had been trying to teach him all along. Sometimes an inheritance isn't something you receive. Sometimes it's something you continue. Would you have helped the stranger that night, knowing absolutely nothing about her? Tell us in the comments. And if someone once helped you when you had nowhere else to turn, maybe this is the moment to tell them. Subscribe to Heartland Stories for more emotional stories about ordinary people, unexpected kindness, and secrets that can change a life forever.